on this Saturday night turned away at the end of their journey. Canada closes irregular border crossings, surprising migrants.
It's a little bit of smoke and mirrors here.
Is the new border deal with the U.S. a human rights issue? China's long game.
It's kind of a playbook where, oh, you're a friend of China.
Chinese Canadians warn of Beijing's sophisticated strategy that stretches beyond their community. Why was his dad approved?
Got told not to make contact with the assessor or with the provider again.
Controversy and questions over medically assisted dying.
I like it because it is Canadian.
And Zellers is back in business, but is the lowest price still the law?
Global National with Farah Nasser.
Good evening to you, and thanks for joining us. A big change today at the Canada-U.S. border. As the clock passed midnight, it became official. A new deal to close a big loophole. Tens of thousands of migrants had been using unofficial border crossings to enter this country, and it meant they could make asylum claims. Now Canadian authorities will be able to send them back. Heartbroken, as some spent months, even years, trying to cross into Canada. Mike Drolet on the rule change and why immigration experts are concerned crossings will still happen, but in a more dangerous way.
If the new sign wasn't enough to deter refugees from entering Canada,
if you're crossing here, you will be arrested.
RCMP officers provided verbal warnings in multiple languages. Those who didn't turn around were still allowed in. But while 24 hours earlier they would have been considered asylum seekers, they're now being returned to the U.S. via another border crossing. That's good news to the ears of Quebec's premier, who applauded Ottawa and Washington for taking action. 40,000 refugees entered Canada via the dirt path at Roxham Road last year alone. And Francois Legault says Quebec's social services are stretched too thin.
I'm very happy.
The issue is in the wording of the 2004 Safe Third Country Agreement. It allowed Canada and the U.S. to return asylum seekers to the country they crossed over from, in Canada's case, the U.S., but only if using a formal border crossing. Getting caught at an unofficial crossing like Roxham Road or Emerson, Manitoba, allowed individuals to remain in Canada while waiting on their refugee claims. Under the revised pact, the entire 6,400-kilometer border now becomes formal, and anyone who applies for asylum within 14 days of crossing will be turned back.
So if you're a refugee and you're desperate for protection, you're going to cross and remain undetected until after 14 days have passed. And of course, you will destroy any proof that you have that you entered when you did, because if you're caught within the 14 days, you're sent back.
That, she says, could create jobs for smugglers. And while Canada has agreed to welcome an additional 15,000 refugees on humanitarian grounds, immigration lawyers worry it won't benefit those crossing on foot.
This idea of 15,000 is simply a distraction, and it doesn't mitigate what has happened now.
Nor will it likely deter refugees desperate to get into the country. Mike Drolet, Global News, Toronto.
The border wasn't the only key issue during the bilateral meetings in Ottawa this week. Increased tension with China was also an important topic during Biden's visit. This especially as the Trudeau government grapples with allegations of Beijing's political interference. For the West Bloc, Mercedes Stephenson spoke with David Cohen. He is the U.S. ambassador to Canada on standing united against China's threats, and she joins me now from Ottawa. Mercedes, there was a lot of discussion in those speeches yesterday about defense, security, and the economy and the war in Ukraine. But a lot of concern about China, too. So what did the ambassador tell you about how prominently these conversations were taking place behind the scenes?
Well, Farah, as you said, there was plenty of direct criticism of Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. Ambassador David Cohen says that Joe Biden and Justin Trudeau wanted to send a clear message to China, too, pointing to the presence of the two Michaels at President Biden's speech in the House of Commons as not only a powerful moment in history, but also a signal to Beijing.
But for me, the emotional punch in the gut of the parliamentary speech was the two Michaels and the comments that both the Prime Minister and the President made about that and about the leadership that Canada has played with now 70 countries attacking arbitrary detention. All of that was China directed. Canada and the United States together are prepared to take on China when China needs to be taken on to protect ourselves from a defense and a commercial capacity.
And Mercedes, you also have a panel of Chinese Canadians on the show this week. Chuck Kwan, he's a pro-democracy advocate, and Joanna Chu, who's a reporter from the Toronto Star. And part of what you're talking about with them is how significant and sophisticated the Chinese government's influence and interference schemes are. So what can you tell us about that?
If our panelists say that the Chinese Canadian community has been warning about Beijing's influence and interference for years, and that China's strategy to get what it wants goes far beyond the Chinese Canadian community. And there's frustration that Ottawa is sort of only talking about this now. Chuck Kwan warns that what is being covered in the media right now is basically the tip of the iceberg. He says it's less than 10% of what's really going on behind the scenes.
From the election of school board trustees to municipal mayors and councillors, to the provincial government, and of course the federal government. So this is something that I think we should be aware that we're not barking up the wrong tree.
And Farah, Joanna Chu is an award-winning author who has written all about China's strategies, and she points out that foreign interference and influence can also take on a friendly face, and that can be just as insidious as it's targeted at businesses, academics, Bay Street, and powerful Canadians. It's sophisticated, and it can even be charming.
Chinese Canadians are talking about how their family friends are threatened if they don't comply, if they don't try to cooperate with China. But the carrot approach, I think, is still a larger slice of the pie of what China tries to do. So, inviting even like pretty low-level politicians, city councillors of smaller towns in Canada to these very lavish VIP, all-expense-paid trips in China.
And Farah, Joanna says that can be used as a way to pressure people not to criticize China on human rights records, and those strategies can bear fruit for decades. So a very long-term approach. We'll have more of all of that on the show tomorrow.
I look forward to the discussion. Mercedes Stephenson in Ottawa. Thank you, Mercedes. And as Mercedes mentioned, this important discussion will be on the West Block tomorrow, right here on Global. And more than 25 people are dead after powerful storms and at least one tornado tore through the southern U.S. overnight. Homes have been reduced to toothpicks and cars thrown around like toys. It's feared more people could be found dead as crews search for residents declared missing, believed to be trapped under the rubble. Global's Brittany Rosen has the latest on the rescue efforts that are underway right now.
This is the wrath of a monstrous tornado that descended on numerous rural towns in Mississippi Friday night. It left an unusually lengthy path of destruction spanning roughly 160 kilometers, uprooting trees, downing power lines, and severing homes and buildings.
We had the tornado sirens going off, warning people to, take cover. It happened so fast.
While Mississippi was at the center of the destruction, the violent storm also battered southern states Alabama and Tennessee. Tens of thousands were reportedly still without power Saturday.
It was coming right behind us because as soon as we got in there, we heard a big boom.
At its climax, golf ball-sized hail and wind gusts of nearly 130 kilometers per hour were reported. It's unclear exactly how many twisters touched down, but the National Weather Service is examining the possibility of a skipping tornado, which has a discontinuous damage path.
Oh, man.
In its wake, the storm left dozens injured and more than 20 people dead.
That was my nephew that passed away. But it's the first storm that ever hit since I've been living.
Hello, search and rescue.
Mississippi officials brace for the death toll to rise as crews sort through piles of the wreckage in hard-to-hit communities like Rolling Fork, which has been plagued with twisters for years. At last count, 4 people were still missing.
I'm very heavy-hearted. At this time, matter of fact, me and my relative, we was texting at the time when the storm was coming through, and I got to hear his last words.
And while officials say the worst has passed, the grief and loss in these communities will be felt for a very long time. Brittany Rosen, Global News.
An explosion at a chocolate factory in Pennsylvania has left 2 people dead and 5 others missing. A nearby weather camera captured yesterday's blast in West Reading, about 100 kilometers northwest of Philadelphia. Today, rescue workers are combing the debris for survivors. Officials say they've already found one person alive.
The discovery of life overnight, of the overnight recovery efforts, provides hope that others still may be found.
The cause of the explosion hasn't been determined yet, but an initial incident report points to a gas leak. It's still unclear how many people were inside the building at the time, but the company employs about 850 people. More protests, some turning violent in France today, this time over an irrigation project in a rural region of the country. Thousands of marchers opposing a planned reservoir that could limit water usage faced off with riot police at a construction site. Police fired tear gas at some who threw fireworks and other projectiles, and some police cars went up in flames. This latest violence comes after unpopular pension reform set up waves of protests across France. The public anger is so bad, a planned visit by King Charles next week has been postponed. And thousands packed the streets of Tel Aviv today to protest a judicial overhaul by the Israeli government. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's plan gives more control to politicians and decreases the role of the Supreme Court. The plan has drawn international criticism, including from top allies. This is the 12th week of demonstrations, which started in January after the reform package was announced. The complex legal battle around medically assisted death. Coming up, a British Columbia man who says his father should not have been eligible to end his life. Medical assistance in dying, or MAID, is one of the fiercest legal debates underway in Canada right now. This month, it was supposed to be legal for people whose only condition is a mental illness. But the federal government delayed that eligibility expansion for at least another year. As Taria Isri reports, it comes after pressure from psychiatrists, patient advocates, and families, including a BC man who says his father was suicidal and still received a medically assisted death.
Dad sitting across from me in the pub.
Christopher Lyon's father received a medically assisted death. To this day, he doesn't know how he was approved.
You should be able to have a very clear understanding about what rationales or what reasons were used to justify that. And we do not have those.
John Lyon was a retired police officer. He loved playing the flute and lived on a boat off Vancouver Island.
That's him in happier times at the
His
pub.
son says his dad struggled with depression and suicidal thoughts. 2 years ago, he was sent to hospital after a sepsis infection and multiple falls.
It was during this time, around thereabouts, he started thinking about, he mentioned MAID.
Not long after, the 77-year-old applied at Victoria's Royal Jubilee Hospital and was granted approval.
I was astounded at this and sort of reiterated my concerns and got told not to make contact with the assessor or with the provider again. I got there on a Thursday night and he died on a Friday.
But even after his death, Christopher says he received few answers from the hospital.
The reasons that we were told, which related to stopping eating and drinking and an infection that he didn't want treated, aren't on that form, so we don't know why.
The health authority for Vancouver Island, Island Health, says it can't comment on specific patients because of privacy concerns. But Christopher Lyon is speaking publicly. He shared his story with a parliamentary committee, arguing that if his father had better access to housing and health care, things may have been different.
This government appears to be inexorably moving from a culture of life to a culture of death.
It is not the kinds of hypotheticals that are trotted out, oftentimes rather hyperbolically, about, oh, well, someone who has just thought about suicide or is feeling down will get out. It is not the case. Read the guidelines.
Under the law, only people with irremediable mental health conditions would qualify.
There is no differentiation between mental illness and other so-called physical or medical conditions. After all, psychiatric illness is a disorder of the human brain.
But this psychiatrist warns there's no consensus on which disorders never improve.
I believe that some people have already received a medically assisted death for reasons that society initially would not have wanted them to.
It's not the kind of death Christopher wanted for his father.
If someone is suicidal and they have an illness that they can use to justify access to MAID with, we end up in some very dangerous places.
A debate about what it means to die on your own terms. Taria Isri, Global News, Ottawa.
A provincial first ahead, the BC agreement allowing an Indigenous community to manage its own child welfare program. A First Nation community in British Columbia has become the first in that province to sign an agreement with the federal government over its own child welfare program. The goal is to reduce the number of Indigenous children in government care by keeping them within their own community. Victoria Femia reports on this historic agreement.
It was a historic and emotional day for the Splatoon First Nation in the Shuswap. Splatoon, along with the federal and provincial governments, signed the first ever coordination agreement in BC. It's aimed at protecting the well-being of First Nations children and allowing the Indigenous community to take charge of its own child and family services. And it was celebrated during a ceremony in Enderby.
We can't stress enough that it does take a community to raise a child, and how do we translate that into an effective child welfare program, because it cannot be just based on the needs of the child, it's got to be based on the needs of the community.
The agreement will transfer $136.2 million to Splatoon over 10 years to support their ongoing delivery of child-family services through their culture and family systems.
Again, restoring the care and the control to the rightful people, which is the community, with the appropriate fiscal resources to be able to do that. What I can say is that the federal government often has provided really bad guidance for First Nations communities, and so we know that the expertise lies in community. And we will continue to be there with the tools that communities need.
Splatoon has been exercising jurisdiction and protecting children under its own bylaws since 1980, and they will continue this work, but now with more funding and tools under this new agreement.
When you have a look at the agreement, you'll see that there are provisions in there for the province to work alongside Splatoon and also to be able to get out of the way. So whatever the nation needs and how children need to be best served is where the province is able to work in partnership.
Former and current First Nations leaders spoke about how important this agreement is for their communities. And Cookbee Doug Thomas said this is especially crucial following the residential schools.
We suffered an identity crisis through the residential school. It caused addiction issues, and that's the reason why this program existed in the first place, and the 60 Scoop existed in the first place, because to take the Indian out of the child was the main directive of these schools.
This agreement is the fifth of its kind in Canada, and it's aimed at improving the lives of First Nations children, as well as reducing the number of them in government care. Victoria Femia, Global News.
Back after a decade, next, Zellers' big bet on nostalgia and if shoppers are buying into the hype. Sydney's iconic Opera House went dark today to mark Earth Hour. All non-essential lights in the Australian city were turned off for an hour to increase awareness about our ecological footprint. In Hong Kong, a darkened skyline with nearly 4,000 companies, organizations, and buildings also joined the campaign. More than 7,000 cities around the world are expected to participate, showing a commitment to protecting the planet from the impacts of climate change. A number of Canadian shoppers are now getting hit hard by nostalgia. After shutting down across Canada 10 years ago, Zellers made a comeback this week. It's testing the waters with a dozen pop-ups located within Hudson's Bay department stores. But the question remains, does the second act of this once popular discount chain have staying power? And Gaviola takes a look.
I still have Zellers back. The first 12 of 25 Zellers locations opening their doors this week in Ontario and Alberta.
I did a lot of shopping in Zellers for my kids, from my grandkids.
For this woman, it's like a homecoming.
I worked with Zellers for 25 years. The day Zeller closed, I retired.
The highly branded pop-ups are occupying 10,000 square feet inside HBC stores, selling items exclusive to Zellers, from clothing and toys to housewares, hoping to cash in on the nostalgia factor that remains long after Zellers shut down across Canada a decade ago. Retail experts say there's an opportunity for a discount retailer to compete with Walmart, Joe Fresh, IKEA, and Dollarama as households deal with high inflation.
And I couldn't wait to get here. I was like, where's the closest location? Scarborough Town Center, we're coming. So we want to see what the good deals are. We're pretty excited.
It is exciting because at least you guys have affordable stuff that people can come and get.
Are you a Zellers customer?
Unlike the original Zellers with its slogan, "Where the lowest price is the law," this resurrection is also targeting mid-price shoppers. But retail analysts aren't optimistic about its staying power after the initial hype dies down.
I just don't see nostalgia as being a long-term sustainable competitive advantage for a retailer. The only thing that could help them if for some reason it got hot, like people, it became trendy to have a Zellers sweatshirt.
There's definitely space for another discount chain, in my opinion. I just don't know if Zellers is that chain necessarily.
With visits to malls on the decline, much of its future success hinges on its ability to connect with consumers online.
We dictate the way that we want to consume more so today than we ever have in the past. And that's created some challenges for some businesses to kind of innovate and adapt and change to.
Another Zellers advantage.
I like it because it is Canadian.
Unlike high-end American retailer Nordstrom, which is pulling out of the country, Zellers is homegrown. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
And that's Global National for this Saturday night. I'm Farah Nasser, and on behalf of our whole crew, I want to thank you so much for spending part of your evening with us. Tonight's Your Canada is this gorgeous bird's eye view of Vancouver. We love seeing your Canada, so please keep emailing us your photos to viewers@globalnational.com. Until tomorrow, take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Good night.